My guest today is Gary Mormino, Professor Emeritus at the University of South Florida. Gary's latest book is Dreams in the New Century, Instant Cities, Shattered Hopes, and Florida's Turning Point, a follow-up to his earlier Land of Sunshine, State of Dreams, A Social History of Modern Florida. Today, we will talk about the social history of Florida. Gary, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks.
First question. So it seems to me that the most unusual, social characteristic of Florida, especially compared to other states, is that the demographic profile of immigrants, and there are a lot of immigrants in a lot of places in the United States, right? But in Florida, a lot of them are old. It's very much a retirement kind of place. And so I would imagine that has an effect, again, compared to other high immigration states on the social environment in Florida. So you can disagree with that premise of that comparison. And I'm wondering, what would the consequences be of that difference in profile to other states?
Well, it's no coincidence that Florida's state song is Old Folks at Home, the old Stephen Foster song. I don't believe Foster ever set foot in Florida, by the way. And but it has not always been a place with unusual numbers of old people or immigrants. For most of American history, until the 1920s or really the post-World War II era, Florida was too small, too distant, too hot, too humid for Americans to care about or visit. They would visit in the winter when they could. That really took off probably in the 1880s. But if you had been in St. Petersburg in the 1920s, there would have been a few communities that you would have thought was kind of a twilight zone, even though the term wasn't relevant in the 1920s. St. Petersburg, Florida would have been one of the first, where you had extraordinary numbers by American standards of senior citizens. For the very simple reason, you don't really need me to explain this, but most Americans died far before their 60s until late in the 20th century. In fact, my wife was having knee replacement last spring. And I was teaching a class in U.S. history, and the doctor said, "I'll call you at 10:30. I said, "Well, I'm going to be in the middle of a lecture." He said, "Well, I need to let you know how it's going." So he calls, and I asked the students. I happened to be doing a lecture that day on the history of old age in America. I asked students, I said, "You realize the reason I'm here and your grandparents are here and great-grandparents, penicillin, statin drugs, knee replacements, all these things." I said, "By the way, what do you think a knee replacement cost?" This is an 18, 19-year-old. They said $1,200, $1,500. So, but getting back to your point, senior citizens have become so identified with Florida. I should have looked it up, but I think it's something like 1 of 3 Floridians is 65 and over. There are several counties in Florida that truly deserve Twilight Zone status, where there are more people 80 and older than 8 and below. And that's the opposite of for most of American history, world history, you had huge numbers of young people, many of whom would never make it into adulthood. And they formed kind of the basis of the triangle. And then you had middle-aged people and a very small number at the top. But for a variety of reasons, medical, political, we're living longer and longer, and it's had an immense impact upon Florida. Politically, this just in, seniors vote, and often. And they have a disproportionate amount of power in Florida. And it's not always true, but in some places, it creates a great power struggle between people who have kids in schools, and the schools aren't very good, and wanting to have a increase in the education tax. And seniors said, I pay for my kids' education in Cincinnati. Why should I vote myself a tax increase here? So you have that tension. Seniors tend to drift Republican in Florida. not, oh, there's an asterisk there, unless you live on the East Coast. Broward, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade until 3 weeks ago was a Democratic stronghold. It went Republican for the first time in decades, many decades. When Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York City, was campaigning for president in 2008, he began his campaign, I think, in Boca Raton or Palm Beach. And he said, I'm glad to be in New York City, 6th borough. There were so many New Yorkers, so many bagel shops. So seniors matter in Florida.
What do they want?
What they want, and that's an interesting question. They want safety. They want to be left alone. They want to enjoy their golden years. I mean, as a senior, by the way, you may have noticed gray hair. I feel fortunate. I'm 75, and most of my ancestors never made it to 75, and I'm still teaching. Seniors also want medical care, and this is often a problem. And a lot of medical staffers are very low paid. Hence, you have this immigrant connection there. Seniors want to be respected politically. I mean, this is a big deal. For instance, your viewers may or may not know the question. This has been true since 2000, maybe 2004. If you're running for national office or statewide office in Florida, you begin your campaign in one place in Florida. You know the answer?
No.
I wonder how many of your viewers ever heard of the Villages. Villages is pretty well known now. There are several documentaries. It's the prototypical senior citizen community. I think it may be 80 to 100,000. I mean, it's freakish, really, in a lot of ways. At one time, they led the state in beer consumption because they had their own brewery, and like from 6 to 6:30, you could get two for $1 draft beers at the Villages. But George W. Bush began the practice, and now, I mean, every national candidate begins the campaign because it's a Republican bulwark. It's kind of south of Gainesville. It's not near a major city at all, and it overlaps 3 counties. It's when I gave a book talk there, I think in 2005, and it was the summer. And the other thing that's famous about the Villages, people don't drive cars as much as golf carts. And they pimp up their golf carts. They'll put a Rolls-Royce grill on the golf cart. Or, their college colors and things like that. And so I'm speaking in the veranda room, this huge room. It's like 400 people there. And all this summer, all of them are 75 and older. And everyone's wearing tennis shoes, tennis shorts. And I'm thinking of my Sicilian grandmother wearing black and heels with her clutching her rosary. And I remember asking, and it's an unfair question, how many of you feel old? And I think one person raised their hand, which is an important point. Old age is relative. In 1900, old age was probably 45. Today, I mean, it's an interesting question to ask your listeners. I would say 70, 75, maybe even older. But we're getting older and older, and it's also very costly to the public in terms of medical benefits, Social Security, Medicare, etc.
So does that mean that Florida, because you just mentioned Medicare, which is, so if I think of the priorities of the Florida electorate, if the marginal voter there is a senior citizen, healthcare for the state, ironically, might not be as important because it's more or less federally provided. Is that?
Sure. Although you
Possible.
get your services locally, yes, that's true.
Right. But so they don't want necessarily to spend money. And because I'm thinking, what are some features of Florida that I kind of note? One of them is it's a very much a humongously diverse ethnic place,
Yes.
right? But a lot of places are, right? It's got a big retired population. That's unusual. It's got a massive coastline, right? It's hot.
150 miles, I believe.
It used to be an agricultural community or area, and kind of no longer is. And it has no state tax, right?
Yes.
So I think that the no state tax and the agricultural thing,
No
I kind of
state
see how they
income.
can go together.
No state income tax.
Yeah, no state income tax, right? But I'm just trying to think, like, of those features, which ones are kind of the most powerful in explaining distinctiveness in Florida? And so that's kind of one maybe a theme we can just sort of keep touching on throughout this conversation. And what is it that is distinctive about Florida? That's like another question. Like, what is the Florida culture? Like, is there something there? You have this Florida man stuff on Twitter, which is hilarious. And I wonder if that's real or distinct.
I hate Florida man, but it is hilarious. I take Florida very seriously, and we've got some serious problems. But it's a fascinating state. And have I told the listeners that we have no state income tax? Many people probably didn't realize this, but in the last 3 years during the Great Pandemic, Florida has had a huge relocation from California and New York of wealthy individuals who seek kind of asylum in Florida in a lot of ways, and they're already paying expensive real estate, so Florida probably seems cheap.
Yeah.
Most of my friends are just, their eyes are popping out at the price of real estate lately because Florida is so desirable. It's warm. It has 1,250 miles of coastline. Something like 80% of the population lives within 30 miles of each coast. The center is relatively unoccupied. You can still see a lot of cattle in places like DeSoto County and places like that. Agriculture is slipping. It's still important. But anyway, getting back to senior citizens, the variety of senior citizen life is fascinating. I remember first time going to a senior citizen facility, not 12 beds, but we're talking about places like Sun City Center, the Villages, and just jaw-dropping the expansive culture. There are scores and scores of clubs there. If you still play chess, there are chess clubs, there are knitting clubs, there are computer clubs. If you look at the social life, who's coming to play at the auditorium, it's like a rerun from the 1970s. These groups that were young in the 70s and 80s are now senior citizens, and they're playing these clubs. The golden years also spark remarriage. That's kind of sweet to see this, as long as it's not your grandmother, I suppose. You've got the ethnic, racial. What I've rarely seen in Florida, by the way, are large numbers of African Americans at these huge places like the Villages, Sun City Center, which was one of the first one outside Tampa. Along the East Coast, there are places called and the name escapes me right now. Look in my book; you'll find it.
So that's interesting. So you're saying that the elderly population skews white, I guess.
Very, very much wider, yes, because
right.
in migration, you do have elderly African Americans migrating here. In fact, in the new book, I talk about that there's a place called it's in Flagler County, which is near St. Augustine. Huge Port St. Lucie is one of them, and you've actually got this pattern of peoples whose families had left Florida in the 1920s during the Great Migration throughout the South. African Americans left because for the first time they had opportunities. They're now migrating back, their grandchildren, because they think places like Miami, Orlando, Tampa are really great places to be young urban professionals. And at one of those places, there was a kind of a club of ex-New Jersey black policemen.
Hilarious.
The reconstitution of affiliations in Florida is just fascinating.
That is interesting. So I'm going to come back to kind of this concept of like what the problems might be there. So we have Florida's got this, the Florida man thing has been very successful. This crazy person kind of reputation. When I go down there, maybe it's because I'm primed for it, but I feel like I see some more weirdness there than at least I do in New Jersey. It's probably the case that weird people are everywhere, but there might be something that attracts a couple of extra ones to Florida. Do you buy that?
I've always asked the question, do crazy people immigrate to Florida, or do perfectly normal people come here and then be a little goofy?
And go crazy.
Part of it is you no longer have the shame of your relatives around you, probably.
Okay.
You wouldn't do these stupid things in Illinois or places like that. But again, I think we've got more important issues to discuss than Florida Man, which seems to me on the outskirts. I do enjoy reading a good Florida Man story, but
well, there's this the way in which the way you might take it seriously, or at least the underlying phenomenon is that this promotes bad behavior, right? So I'm in the insurance industry, right, and what insurance professionals see is a lot of duplicity amongst claimants, and it looks like there's something that underlies, some of that's incentives, but the incentives come from somewhere too. They're designed by policy, right? So there's some kind of like underlying structure here that is it an excessive permissiveness? I'm not sure, but it's definitely a different place to adjust an insurance claim, Florida, than it is elsewhere. There must be a social kind of like driver of that. What do you think?
Well, let me give you an example, which you'd be all too familiar with. One of the problems after hurricanes, of course, is roof damage. And probably in Illinois, if you knew your insurance agent because you went to school with him, you probably wouldn't send in a fraudulent claim knowing that it was fraudulent. Whereas here, some out-of-state company or whatever. So I think that tends to reinforce the behavior. But you really see this after hurricanes, the scams. It's heartbreaking sometimes, the consequences of this. But so much of this has to do, so many of the themes we've talked about this morning, is it's a state of strangers.
Right.
So, for instance, in 9/11, was it coincidence that about 2/3 of the terrorists lived and planned the attack on 9/11, living in places like Venice and Cape Coral and places like that? No, not really, because if everyone around you is a newcomer and a stranger, you can blend in pretty easily. They were even going to public libraries and using a computer to ask questions, how do I guide a plane into a skyscraper? I mean, today you'd have about 15 seconds and the FBI would burst in the door. But it was a different world in September 2001, but largely because Florida, particularly in places like Palm Beach County, Charlotte County, almost every county in Florida, you have more strangers than people who've been there 2 or 3 generations.
Is that captured in the data somewhere? Because I'm trying to come out with sort of the, you might call the cross-sectional variation of other states, right? So there are lots of states with lots of immigrants. Is it that, within the United States, migration is especially high in Florida if you compare it to California, is in some ways the alternate universe twin of Florida, right? It's
Oh,
very sunny, lots of
very
immigrants,
quick, yes.
lots of retirees, but it has some really different characteristics. Housing prices are much higher. There's more mountains, less retired folks. Seems to have a little bit less zaniness. How would you compare Florida and California socially?
In many ways, Florida is California on the cheap.
Okay, interesting.
But they're the two dream states. There was a California state librarian who wrote a book in the 1970s, 1980s called California and the American Dream. And he kind of pioneered these things. So I've kind of copied him in a lot of ways. Met him several times, and a really good guy. But there are fascinating parallels. California grew much faster earlier than Florida. I think in 1940, California had 8 million people, and Florida 2 million people. And I may be lowballing it, by the way. Same thing with California or Florida and New York. On the eve of World War II, Florida was the smallest state in the American South, smaller than that of South Carolina or Arkansas. It was about 1/4 or 1/5 the size of New York. In 2012, Florida surpassed New York in population. We're about 23 million people now. California and New York are not growing fast at all. In fact, maybe losing people. Florida is growing, but not at that frenetic pace, which is probably good. But Florida and California are dream states, and the idea being, Kevin Starr was his name, the California librarian. He said there are special characteristics to be a dream state. I don't think you're going to, after this interview, you're going to be calling anyone in North Dakota saying, let's talk about the North Dakota dream in November. But dream states need long, many miles of coastline. California, Florida, probably number one and number two, if you exclude Alaska. Palm trees, swaying palm trees, to use in imagery. Balmy winters. But most importantly, this is the vital ingredient, the promise, the hint of a better life. So if you leave your farm in Illinois and go to California or Florida, you'll have a better life. You'll live longer. You'll have a second chance. F. Scott Fitzgerald said there are no second acts in American life. There are second chances. If you went bankrupt in New York, you can move to Florida and start again. So there are second chances. You're widowed. You might marry again in Florida. So Florida is a place. Finally, there's the idea of a better life, or at least a better February in Florida. And I think, and have I mentioned no state income?
Right.
Florida's not as cheap as it was. I mean, it's getting pricier, but oh my God, when I moved here in '77, I look back, it's almost head slapping why I didn't buy City of Clearwater or something. And for senior citizens especially, of all those qualities, think that it's warm in the winter. You're widowed, but you have a possibility of new romance or new friendships, etc. So Florida and California, what happened in California is California really went through a rough turmoil in the 90s with a variety of issues.
Yeah.
And both
Race
states
riots.
are also very susceptible to natural disaster. Earthquake in the West, hurricanes here.
Yeah, the coincidences are, the list is long. Yet I think California and California's a big place. I'll tell you one thing that I looked at, I was researching for this. The two states that have risen most in population density in the last 100 years since I could get census data from 1910 are Florida and California. I was shocked about that. I did not think. So California, they're like both in the 40th, sort of like the 40s, the ranking, 50 states. And now they're, I don't know, 5 and 3 or something like that in terms of population density, right? So that's the ranking of population density, right? So that accounts for all the growth or in or out migration, all the other states. So that I was not expecting. I was expecting that of Florida. I was not expecting California to sort of be neck and neck there. And yet it seems so, like this concept of if you go from an agricultural state that's sparsely populated, you can have a certain social, cultural, political kind of situation, right? Both those states probably had that 100 years ago. Florida somehow has preserved some of this intense individuality, but California has not. California has gone hard left, right? Communitarian, kind of quasi-socialist. I think that's just, I think that's an objective fact. Very democratic. Yes. Even the Republicans are democratic over there, right? And Florida is very different. Like those are two really divergent political outcomes from, if you kind of line up the characteristics, you think like, well, what caused that?
Yes. For Florida, I think number one would probably be retirees moving here, especially from the Midwest. Although retirees from the Midwest also left earlier for California. But another factor connecting California and Florida is World War II. World War II was the big bang in a lot of ways. Both states were on the eve. Well, California was much heavier populated than Florida in 1940. Both states because they were on the oceans. Both states had a large number of military bases, so you had millions of Americans training there, and the GIs must have thought, God, this is beautiful. I mean, if you're from North Dakota and you were in Miami Beach or Long Beach in 1942, someday I'm going to return. And in many ways, every GI returned to Florida as a tourist, as a transplant, as a retiree, or buried in a military cemetery. There are so many military cemetery burials every day, they've run out of buglers. Most of the taps are now played at military funerals. They're cassettes inside a bugle. I hate to spoil this. But by the way, that's the next book I'm working on is World War II in Florida. It's such an exciting work. I mean, the number of people, future famous people, including George Herbert Walker Bush, John Kennedy, John Kennedy's late brother, all had training in Florida in World War II. In fact, George Herbert Walker Bush learned to fly at Fort Lauderdale Airfield.
Did they?
And the idea that his son later became governor of Florida. I mean, wow, the American dream.
So you mentioned one point earlier, which is like another stark. So I think one data point that really differs. Again, harping on this Florida, California. There's still throw in the mix here is Arizona, which is one that seems to be kind of like Florida in some ways, politically maybe. Lots of immigrants, great weather, no coastline.
As well, yes, both places.
Yes, and it seems like the property prices in California are kind of like double per square foot what they are in Florida. So that's a really big difference. And then the retiree population in Florida, I bet you they're kind of a tie on the migration, you'd think, right? And weather.
Different types of immigrants, but certainly. The one connector there is air conditioning. We're not having this conversation without air conditioning. You can't live in Arizona most of the year. You can't live in Florida most of the people did, but we're wussies now. I mean, compared to our ancestors. It's no accident that the first modern, relatively inexpensive air conditioner came in the 50s. the carrier window unit coincide with Florida's Big Bang.
Right. And that wasn't as much of a requirement in California. I guess
No,
it's drier,
it
right? The heat, and then at night it's probably not so bad. So that's
There's
amazing.
even a great lawsuit in Hollywood, Florida. There is a Hollywood, Florida.
Yeah.
In the 1950s, a neighbor sued a neighbor. What do you think the lawsuit was over?
I don't know.
The neighbor's air conditioner was clanging. If you're too young to remember, but the window units, often if a screw was loose, you would have this rattling. And they're saying, we can't sleep at night because of the neighbor's rattling air conditioning. And the judge concluded, this is kind of like the first automobile and the horse. You're going to have to get used to this. But air conditioning, I mean, most of the places I teach now, there are no windows. That even if for some reason electricity was no longer possible, you couldn't teach indoors in many places in Florida. Where you drive in your air-conditioned car, get in air-conditioned lobbies, etc. We're totally addicted to air conditioning.
I remember one. I was down in Florida on business, and somebody I was doing business with. I was driving them to lunch or something, and they got in my rental car. And the speed and almost like automaticity of them cranking the air conditioning when they got in, it was like an I didn't even remember he did it. Where he's like, all the air conditioning out to max as soon as you step in the car. It's like, man, you did this a lot, more than me. So I want to talk a bit about to the agricultural kind of culture there, which was, I mean, the predominant culture in Florida. Up until probably, I mean, more recently, I don't know, can you maybe trace some of the history of that?
Well, you're right. I mean, Florida and California both, in the 19th century, became America's fruit basket and winter vegetable basket. Warm winters. The soil in Florida is not necessarily that great, but not with fertilizers, etc. And if it were muckland, it was good. Both places you needed a pliable workforce, and thus you had county sheriffs who had almost unlimited power to enforce what we would now recognize as kind of a semi-peonage. But from Florida, I mean, it's the Orange State. I mean, it's on license plates. It's the state nickname. There's like a half a dozen Citrus County, Orange County, Tangerine Drive, etc. But as we discussed earlier, in my first day, I now teach a class called Food and History. And the first day we come in, and the first question I ask students seems unusual. How many of you, tell me what you had for breakfast today? And by the way, it would appall mothers out there how bad a diet is. But what's missing, of course, if you're my age, is no one is drinking orange juice anymore. It's for a variety of reasons. It's too fattening. It's too uncool. You have too many options. You can get kiwi flavored water or whatever. But orange juice, the citrus industry in Florida this winter, for the first time since World War II, has fallen below the production of California. We surpassed California in the mid-1940s. And if you think about it, you would assume California citrus groves would be far more valuable than Florida's and would have been surrendered to housing. But I was shocked that California still had that much citrus in production. I live in Pinellas County, St. Petersburg. As late as 1950, we were number 5 in the state, something 50,000 cartons a year. Even when I arrived in the 70s, you could drive down some of these non-interstate roads, and there'd be scores of citrus groves, and to lure you in, they'd give you a free glass of fresh orange juice in hopes you'd buy or send the case back home, etc. But we've lost our taste for juice, and it's really sad. The big bang there was during World War II. They developed frozen concentrate. There had always been so much loss. And if you think of the typical baby boom mother in the 1950s with 5 children, she doesn't have time to squeeze orange juice anymore. So that,
Kidding.
and someone wrote, I think I wrote it actually, the most eloquent sentence in the English language is, mix with 2 glasses of water and stir. Actually, mix with 2 cans of water and stir.
Mm-hmm.
And any of your listeners younger than 40 won't get this, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I remember concentrated orange juice. I'm only just older than 40. And is the difference, because I think of the kind of the features of Florida, the agricultural decline, could that be that they're paving over those Florida groves for condos in Florida? In California, they're not doing that because the groves aren't anywhere near the coast, and people want to live on the coast. Is living on the coast kind of like the defining feature of the Florida dream?
Near the coast.
Yeah.
Although there's a footnote.
Seeing the water.
Hurricane Ian, Hurricane Charlie, Hurricanes Michael, living near the water is increasingly expensive and dangerous, and precarious. Florida's really having a debate over this, whether we're out of our minds to continue reinsuring houses on barrier islands. And now it's not going to happen. Florida is a very conservative state. Those island communities generate a tremendous amount of tax receipts. But there is an articulate argument is that either 2 things should happen. You're on your own. That no one's going to insure you anymore. The state, it's just too dangerous to insure these very expensive places on islands like Sanibel. Or, and this isn't going to happen either because this is a conservative state, turn them into national seashore sanctuaries. If you've ever been to Cumberland Island off the Georgia-Florida coast, there's an Andrew Carnegie Castle there. There are no houses there anymore. And in 1970s, the federal government said this island should belong to everyone. So the deal was, we're not going to make you move now. But when you die, the government will pay your heirs a fair price for your home, and we will tear the home down. And it's going to be basically a national island. It's not going to happen, but I think it's an interesting idea to pursue.
So the third option, I would say, to your 2, 1, you're on your own, can't get insurance. 2, we're going to eliminate the houses and not need insurance. The third one is they socialize the insurance, right? Becomes like a Medicare kind of program for Florida residents, where now the Florida government foots the bill for these things, right? I mean, Florida's got a pretty long history of
conservative state. That seems out of the box, but if it works, I'm willing to listen.
Well, I mean, I don't.
We're running out of options. Let's face it.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, this is not an analysis of what works. I think that's my insurance analytical mind says that's insane, because there's all sorts of reasons why governments aren't quite as good at this as the private market. But this is like a kind of inevitability, right? After Hurricane Andrew, you probably know this, but the state insurance regulator more or less locked the doors for a bunch of insurance companies and said, you can't raise rates or you have to leave the entire state. And many of them did. and it created a weird little insurance industry in Florida full of very small companies who are pretty vulnerable to the vagaries of the reinsurance market for their capital. And that can go away, and they can pay their claims, but they might not be able to write any policies next year. Every year that can happen, and this year we're going to be in a renewal pretty dire renewal market for the capital of those little insurance companies. And we'll kind of see how it pans out, but it's not a stable situation. And part of the reason is that Florida doesn't want to pay. It doesn't want its customers to pay the prices that the biggest insurance companies want to charge to stick around. And so there's like a tension there where we don't want to think about what it really costs to live on the coast in Florida.
As I understand it, after 2003, where 2004, we had 4 hurricanes in 5 weeks. Charlie, Francis, Ivan, and I've forgotten the fourth. Gene. It's so devastated the insurance market that the big companies, State Farm, et cetera, said, we're out of here. We'll set up dummy companies with a State Farm affiliation, but the national company is not responsible when they go bankrupt. Do I have that correct? Is that?
I think that actually happened after Hurricane Andrew.
Okay, which was 1993.
3 or 4. Yeah.
And there's no question with global warming, hurricanes are getting more explosive, and our willingness to live on the water's edge is creating kind of an apocalyptic situation. I mean,
well, that's the expectation for folks, right? I think about kind of like if the Florida deal is you move here from Illinois and you can live on the water, and that's awesome. If you were in Illinois, that would cost you a lot of freaking money, but here it doesn't because we have so much coastline. So come on and live on the coast. It was like brilliant. I want to retire on the coast with no state tax. And then you show up, and it's like, well, we've kind of not really been telling you what it really costs to live on the coast. You get a bait and switch, and then they're like, too bad. I'm living on the coast, and I'm going to vote for whatever politician lets me stay here. Is that the deal?
I think that's a dead reckoning.
Okay, so there's another kind of piece to this, which I think that even maybe makes that point even stronger. You're probably sick of hearing people tell you this, but you've called Florida a Ponzi scheme, and I know you're exaggerating it, but maybe you could explain that dynamic.
Well, George Packer of New Yorker magazine was in my office. I should add, I had no idea who he was. My colleagues only told me later. But it's 2008. The Great Recession has just racked Florida. And he said, you have a metaphor for Florida. I said, well, in many ways, it's the Ponzi state. But let me explain. It's as a metaphor, the idea Florida works very well when 1,000 newcomers arrive every day, which they have been except for downturns in the economy. That's scary, but 1,000 newcomers a day. And everything hums. They're paying property taxes, so the people who sell sod and siding and who pay state taxes, who pay the teachers, everyone's happy. No one ever asks what happens when they stop coming. And that's what happens during a Great Recession. They stop coming. Florida was even losing people at one time. So the next week, I get a call from the Chamber of Commerce saying, what the hell just happened? I'm holding a cover of New Yorker magazine. It says the Ponzi state, and it blames you on this. So I was not the most popular person in St. Petersburg at that time. But I think it is a metaphor that works. By the way, Ponzi, who was an Italian immigrant, did come to Florida and practice his scheme here in the 1920s.
Of course he did.
Of course.
Brilliant. Florida man steals money from people. Should
we explain what a Ponzi scheme is? You think your readers will know that?
I think they, for the most part, will. We can leave them to look it up. The way in which that, so if I'm like the leader of Florida, is it the state assembly speaker? Is it the governor or whatever the synthesis of those people? What do they want? Well, they want the growth because every place works better when everything's growing. I mean, that's not just the Florida. The amazing thing about Florida is how fast it was growing. And so everything works so well as a consequence of that. And you kind of always want to regain that because, as a politician, you want to deliver that to people. That's what the people want. Like, it's not, I don't think there's anything nefarious about this. I think there's something quite deep about the human condition that we all want to grow. We all want more money coming in. It's just like life is easier that way, right? So if one of the foundational tenets of that explosive growth, I mean, in a good way, was lots of coastline for people to move to. And if the insurance industry says, hey, or let's just abstract even farther away, if global warming or whatever force at work there means more hurricanes, then the cost of living on the coast is going up. So the deal needs to be rewritten, right? Like somehow, you want to preserve the attractiveness of living on the coast because it is nice to live on the water with the appropriate safety protocols, building regulations, some way to make it sustainable, because otherwise it is a Ponzi scheme in the sense that you're buying into something and once you got it, you got to get out again in order for it to make any sense at all. You want to have like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or at least more rainbow, as opposed to having the thing just sort of suddenly get cut off. When the Cat 5 finally hits Miami or Tampa, you don't want to like truly obliterate all these barrier islands. You want those homes to be able to handle it, or have towers be able to handle it. Like I got to think some communities are doing better than others in these circumstances. There must be a way forward here, because the state just nationalizing all the insurance in Florida, to me, is like one possible outcome here. And, seniors, as right-wing as they are in Florida, they all vote for Medicare no matter which party's in power. They all like the subsidized insurance. And so I think they will equally like subsidized housing prices and their ability to live on the coast. So I think they'll vote for it if they get that option. What's the real alternative?
Interesting. I use an example in the book, in the Land of Sunshine book, written 10 years ago, that if your viewers remember the movie Fantasia, which is appropriately Florida, Walt Disney's parents were born and married in Florida. They were the first couple married in Lake County, I think in 1890.
Really?
And as luck would have it, a freeze at that time drove them to Chicago, where Walt helped tear down the World's Fair. And the story is he feared Chicago would corrupt his children. So he moved to Marceline, Missouri, which is the set. And I always ask audiences, how many of you have been to Marceline, Missouri? I think one person out of thousands. Marceline, Missouri is also Main Street Disney. It's his homage. But in his film, he really threw the dice down when he made this film, Fantasia. I think it's 1940. Unlike a Mickey Mouse, this is really, it's got German symphonic and Russian symphonic elements, German folk tales. And in the story, Mickey the Mouse is apprenticed to Yen Sid, the wizard of the castle. And the apprentice needs to haul buckets of water to the well. And after a while, the well begins to flood, and the mouse doesn't know what to do. So he takes the wizard's hat and commands. I'm sorry. The wizard arrives, and with the right incantation, stops the chaos. And this all sets up for your question. How do we create a Florida that has all the elements people want? Beautiful parks, seaside that's available to everyone to visit and tour, and have affordable housing and good paying jobs and a clean environment. I mean, that's something no wizard can create. I mean, that's kind of a state dialogue here, and we're not having a very fruitful one, I think. And the Governor Scott is very concerned. Actually, he's no longer a governor; he's the senator. Ron DeSantis will probably track me down. Ron DeSantis is running for president, and he's very proud of his conservative stamp on the state. So, you know, the great quest for kind of a utopia in Florida is unmet, I think.
Well, I think that, very narrowly, something's going to happen to try and improve some of the social environment to keep what little insurance capital is inside of Florida there. So that's something that's going to happen. But to me, the more longer term problem is an acknowledgement of this hurricane problem, right? So during Florida's big run up through the 90s, up through really 2004, they had very, very little activity on that coast. I mean, I think if you stretch back the course of history, and I think you even survey some of this history in one of your books. Right. I mean, it's sticking out into that Gulf, it's the most hurricane-prone place on this planet of ours by a long way. And we're starting to see that happen. You have historical periods of quiescence, and then you have historical periods of activity and increased activity we are expecting. So, we're going to pay the hard way. To me, the decision, the thing that worries me is the default, which is inactivity, will result in something kind of terrible for Florida residents, and it will truly, be a social disaster, I think, because then people are going to lose. Here's one thing that I wonder about, are condo towers versus houses on barrier islands. Houses on barrier islands tend to be owned by very wealthy people, right? Even in Florida, I got to think,
yes,
right? But condo towers are where most people actually live, and they must be better off. I mean, these communities. You shaking your head? Do you agree? No. Yeah. So is that the answer? Everybody just live in a condo who lives near the coast?
I urge readers to read John D. MacDonald, who was a great mystery writer, and he wrote a book called Condominium, 1970 or so, might have been earlier. But in that is all the elements you just talked about, except at the time, no one could have imagined this conversation. But you've got this condominium built. It's shoddy materials because of bribes, etc. It's got all the elements there, and the big one comes. And the big one really hasn't come yet. I mean, both Charlie and Ian were supposed to hit Tampa Bay head on, both of them, until 24 hours before every forecast. Tampa Bay. It is so built up, the barrier islands, with high-rise condos and wealth. It would have been the worst financial catastrophe in American history, probably environmental catastrophe, and both lurched at the last minute and went through less densely populated county, Charlotte in this case.
It was a near miss.
Yeah, but how many near misses can you have? I mean, it's a pretty big target.
It's quite surprising that they do nearly miss often and frequently. I don't begin to understand kind of why that is. Maybe it's just random variation. Eventually, one will spin right in.
But you're right. Until Andrew, and then from Andrew until Charlie, you had relatively few hurricanes in the preceding 20 years. Not say Donna in 1960. From Donna, really to the 1990s, you had relatively few threatening hurricanes, and people were thinking this is like diphtheria. It's something that happened to your great-grandfather, but it no longer really is scary. And they come in cycles, and we're paying a price. And I mean, what we're really not having is a state dialogue about this. The governor should sit down with insurance leaders, some environmental scientists. Let's have an honest discussion about what kind of state do we want to be. What can we still be that state and ignore hurricanes and the insurance issue? Who owns the islands?
Are you aware of anybody having ever done something like that,
No.
either in Florida or
There
outside
were
of Florida.
governors who would have done it earlier, but it just wasn't a big issue. Leroy Collins in the 50s and 60s, I'm convinced, would have. Reuben Askew from Pensacola, a place famous for hurricanes, would have welcomed this. But I think it's just a political non-factor now. That at least our governor today doesn't want to meet with hurricane scientists because
Not good news.
the news is not the news they want, and the outcome they want, and the criticism they want.
What are the issues in Florida that people are focused on? What is the thing that they want?
Well, growth is the issue everywhere, but not just on the coast, but everywhere. Immigration is an issue. It's stunning. In 2000, when the new millennium rolled over, there was a New York Times headline that I thought, and I thought I knew Florida pretty well, but it said, for the first time in Florida, there are now more Hispanics than blacks. You have to go, if you go back in Florida history, as late as 1880, there were probably more African Americans living in Florida than whites. But which shows you it's not that the black population has shrunk. It's that immigration, the headline was more Hispanics than blacks. So immigration is a major issue. It used to be Cubans. Now the latest new immigrant groups are Venezuelans and Puerto Ricans. And I realize I'm not dumb. Puerto Ricans are not immigrants. They're American citizens, but they're immigrating here from the island, or more likely from New York, because their families have been in New York for a generation or two. It's expensive. It's scary. So particularly outside Orlando, many of them work in the Orlando service industry.
What are the differences or similarities? I think that within the U.S. migration, culturally, in terms of influence, could be just as impactful as in between country migration. Do we not measure that? People moving from Illinois, does that turn up in the stats somewhere?
It does, and I think one of the stats I used from 1950 to 2000, I think it was, for every 4 senior citizens who moved out of a state, not within the state, but from a state to a new state, 1 in 4 moved to Florida. And that is astonishing. 25% of America's senior population. It's declined a little bit in the last 20 years, but it's still significant. And one of the new factors, and you hinted this at the beginning, you now have senior immigrants. Immigration was always a young man's, a young woman's adventure. But now, because of heightened awareness, because of possibilities, because of wanting to unify families, senior immigrants, senior Cubans, senior Venezuelans want to reunify with their family. If I were asked who's the most important figure in modern Florida history, it's not Henry Flagler, it's Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro transformed Florida. If you've never been in Little Havana, I would urge every reader, if you go to Miami, make sure you go to Little Havana. It is a fascinating dynamic, in the best sense, by the way. This is not Titanic watching. This is really a dynamic community, and clearly a dynamic political community. As late as 2000, many demographers were predicting Cubans are going to turn Democratic. They had been staunchly Republican for obvious reasons, but in fact, they're doubling down now. They're still it's, if you think about it, if you're the grandson of a Cuban immigrant from 1960, your major concern in life is not Fidel Castro, who's dead. You have all the concerns of Americans, getting a job, making sure your kids have good education. And these are the issues that affect immigrants and Floridians and Americans.
And so you're saying that the Fidel Castro being the most important figure in Florida is because of the Cuban Revolution, and that just sparked a massive influx of Cuban immigrants to Miami.
Millions. I mean, and it also realigned the state politics.
Yeah.
That John Kennedy, the president, during the Bay of Pigs, never followed up with an aerial bombardment, changed the dynamics of Florida's history and American political history in many ways. That the Cuban vote has been a solid Republican vote since 1961. And I should add, no immigrant group ever received more favorable treatment than Cuban Americans. I mean, because we wanted to embarrass Fidel. What better way to humiliate Fidel than have his refugees succeed in America? So the amount of government training, bilingual training, etc., was pretty impressive, or horrifying, depending upon your readers' viewpoints.
Right. So that it seems to me like the concept of the Republican Party's principles, or at least call it anti-communist principles, right? So to a certain extent, Florida's an anti-communist kind of reactionary place, right? Venezuela the same. So people who come to Florida from these Venezuela, the two most important immigrating countries to Florida, are highly socialist places.
Venezuelans are the newest and most potent political figures in Florida because of the sheer numbers. And the fact that, I mean, Venezuela is worth a podcast. I mean, this was the model South American country in 1960. They had, I believe, a higher quality of life than many first world countries. And they had vast amounts of petroleum. And here, socialist experiments turned disaster.
Yeah,
it's very depressing to witness this. But Doral and Weston in Miami-Dade County are the two biggest Venezuelan colonies in Florida, and they call Doral Darazuela is the nickname. If you want a arepa, that's the great Venezuelan snack, main dish.
I haven't had it. I will try that next time I'm down there.
The cornmeal crust is quite tasty.
I imagine it's amazing. So, one of the things that seems to be the case everywhere else is inside of large cities, you have more of a left-leaning kind of political, or community-oriented, I guess. My own private personal explanation is that there are a lot of rules that society can write helps people just sort of live really close to each other, and without those rules, it seems that large cities are almost always left of the rural areas. But in Florida, we kind of have seniors, Venezuelans, Cubans, seriously countering that trend and kind of resulting in a different political dynamic than you might get somewhere else.
I used to argue 10 years ago that it's wrong to talk about Republican-leaning, Democratic-leaning counties in Florida, that you had Democratic-leaning cities, but Republican counties. But there would be more Democratic votes. And that's blurred a little bit. Miami-Dade, in the election a few weeks ago, Miami-Dade went Republican. Republican, which it has been. Miami-Dade had been relatively Democratic because of the Jewish presence there. But in general, the big cities in Florida are not as left-leaning. They are, depending where. Jacksonville is Republican, for instance. Jacksonville is the biggest city in Florida, but Jacksonville is a little unusual. The city and county are the same. So Duval County is the same as the city of Jacksonville. But it's also the only major county in Florida that's not minority majority.
Right. It's more of a southern kind of city, and in some ways, ironically, in the North Florida, as people point out. So you wind up any solution to the kind of the problems as the insurance industry looks at this, which is my main, perspective on Florida, is going to have to be a solution that caters to Republican right-wing kind of priorities somehow.
Yes.
Is that fair, you think?
Legitimate.
Wonder how we do that.
Not likely to change dramatically.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think that once you have some path dependence, once you have a certain political culture, it attracts people who want that culture.
Well,
right?
To be honest, the Republicans have outflanked the Democrats in recruiting candidates. The names would be meaningless to your listeners, but when the new century opened in 2000, you had two young Democrats, Peter Rudy Wallace and Jim Davis, good-looking guys, Ivy League credentials, etc. One in the Florida legislature, the other in the U.S. Congress. One ran for governor and lost, and both of them dropped out basically. In that, I think they concluded there's not much of a future to be a Democratic leader in this state. I mean, if you're a Democrat living in Florida today, you've never known a Democratic governor in the new century, in the 21st century. There hasn't been a Democratic governor since, I think, 1999. And by the way, you should give a prize out to anyone. The answer is Buddy McKay, who had served for 1 month after Lawton Child died. But when I arrived in the late 70s, there was a long list of iconic Democrats. Bob Graham, who was U.S. Senator and Governor. Lawton Childs, the he-coon, who never lost an election in his life. And several others. I'm trying to think. I can't even come up with a name of a Democrat you'd want to put money in saying can't miss. The Republicans have just outworked, and also it's the demographics. It's demographics is destiny in politics.
Yeah.
But you never know what a disaster, the consequences politically could be. 9/11, for instance. What if? Just what if?
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully, when we find out, it'll be a better situation. Preparedness in Florida. So we'll have to end it there, Gary. My guest today is Gary Mormino, latest book, Dreams of a New Century. Appreciate your time, Gary. Thank you.
Thanks. A lively conversation.